One thing I've gotten into the habit of doing is browsing through the comments section. I know, many people consider it to be taboo, but I am completely hooked on it. Even negativity thrown my way can be used as constructive criticism when taken at the right angle. Of course, it's not always criticism thrown my way. A lot of the time, the disdain is merely directed towards Victoria 3. In one particular case, someone went into great length about why Victoria 3 isn't a particularly good game because he believed it to completely lack replayability. Every single game plays out exactly the same as every other game, he claimed. I know I'm going out on a limb here as a highly biased Victoria 3 YouTuber whose entire channel depends on the success or failure of this game. However, I thought long and hard about the subject, and I have to state that I disagree vehemently with his sentiments. Victoria 3 has a large quantity of replayability. How do I know? I keep getting sucked in to replay it time and time again. Sure, I have to challenge myself not to take Gaza each and every single game, but the existence of a particular meta never really hurt the replayability of other games, did it? I know I've talked about this a lot in the past, but I'm actually an old head. I'm such an old head that I'm about to take you back decades to a time when I myself was a child. In those days, we had weird wonderments known as Blockbuster Video and arcades. Back in those days, we did not have a bevy of choice when it came to our games. You had access to whatever was in the arcade at that time, and whatever game you happened to rent for that weekend. If the games were good, great. If they weren't, you made do. Renting a game at Blockbuster meant that your whole weekend revolved around playing the same game endlessly until you had to return it on Monday. Heaven forbid if it was a bad game though. I actually beat Milan's Secret Castle back when it was released because I was stuck with it for a week on a weekly rental for a vacation where I had only one other game to play with. A lack of options actually teaches you to be much more selective with the games that you pick out, and it also teaches you to appreciate the games that bring you entertainment. I've replayed Final Fantasy VI, otherwise known as Final Fantasy III in America, at least 1,000 times for that reason. I ended up caving in and buying it after renting it 4 times in a row. Now, in regards to arcades, before the advent of dancing games, there were 2 games in particular that seemed to have me completely hooked. One was King of Fighters. My prepubescent brain was completely in love with Mai Shiranui back in those days. The other was Street Fighter II Championship Edition. If you've been living under a rock and aren't familiar with the concept of fighting games, you're always on the same footing when you're up against your opponent. Matchups can vary depending on the viability of the characters that you pick, but ultimately, each and every single game is played the same way. One would probably take a look at fighting games and go, why would they replay the same thing over and over and over? The answer is quite simple. It's not the same thing. Even if you're playing single-playered, the AI will react differently depending on its set skill level, the number of the stage you're fighting on, and how you initially acted. Granted, you can actually solve the game on how it's played and perfect the meta to the point where you can be considered a professional player, yet, even for those people on the highest level AI, things are still difficult enough to remain challenging. However, the real sense of challenge comes when you're playing against other people. Still, there are metas involved. You can still spam fireballs as Ryu or Psycho Crushers as Dictator, otherwise known as M. Bison in America. Yes, it is cheesy, it breaks a sense of challenge, and it annoys the everlasting heck out of people who happen to be playing or even watching. Yet, it is also very predictable, and it can easily be defeated by somebody else who happens to know what they're doing. But I digress. We're not talking about cheese today, we're talking about replayability. Victoria 3's replayability comes from the sense of challenge that you can get from doing things people have never seen before. Whether it's conquering the world with a tiny country like Kafiristan, or actually deigning to complete one of those ridiculous achievements like Azadi, Victoria 3 is not a completely solved game by any measure. The fact that it is a grand strategy game makes the concept of solving the game almost impossible. Sure, you can abuse the everlasting hell out of new metas, exploits, and cheese. It can make the early 10 years of every game look identical to how Ryu would begin a match by spamming fireballs. Thankfully though, things will always fall apart in the mid-game. There is simply too much RNG involved for things not to fall apart. Great players will always have to roll with the punches that come their way, and even the greatest players in the world will have to deal with repeated law failures. Does this mean that every game has a samey feel to it? Well, in a way, yes. I can confidently say that the first 10 years of every game, should you be following the meta, will likely end up the same way every single time. However, it's no different than playing League of Legends and following the same build orders every single game. The actual team fights at the end of the game are where the action is. That's why I'd say the real replayability in Victoria 3 isn't the startup. It's not the first 10 years. It's not where the meta is most likely to be found. Instead, it's in the mid-game where everything starts to ramp up. Sometimes Persia will be puppeted by Russia. Sometimes Argentina will end up allied to Great Britain. Sometimes Mexico will beat the United States and they'll break apart into 3 different countries. Sometimes Qing won't be invaded and will actually become powerful. Sometimes France will skyrocket to 3 times Great Britain's GDP and strength. Sometimes Super Germany will form to ruin your gameplay. Sometimes you will lose every single law and be stuck in the Stone Age by 1886. Over the last 2 weeks, I did exceptionally long live stream events. One, I played as the Ottomans for 12 hours straight until the end of the game, and in the other, I played as Brazil for 13. Convention would tell you that Brazil is the far harder game, as they start out weaker, with lower population, worse resources, and more irritating journal entries to contend with. Yet, in the Ottoman game, I barely capped out at 100 million GDP by the end of the game. I counted. I actually failed 12 times to pass a law. I was attacked a total of 6 times by coalitions. I lost 2 wars due to random bugs, and I never recovered. How is that your typical snowball gameplay? How is that anything but entertaining? That was an intensely cursed game, and I loved/hated every single minute of it. In the Brazil game, I easily capped out at over 700 million GDP. I don't think I failed any laws thanks to taking creative legislature as my power block mandate. I was attacked a few times, but the coalitions were far weaker than me and were easily put down. It was a very basic, fun, simple game. I spent most of it just maxing out my migration to draw in as many people as possible, since I implemented house rules that prevented me from conquering outside of South America, which I already fully owned by 1900. Yes, I had to impose a personal rule to make the game more difficult, and I do wish the game offered more options like this to actually enforce said house rules. However, that doesn't dissuade the fact that I am still enjoying Victoria 3 immensely, even now. It's no different than giving another player a handicap by not spamming fireballs as Ryu, or trying to beat Mortal Kombat without the use of the jump kick plus uppercut cheese combos. Victoria 3 is a vast grand strategy game, and even if you play 100% the same every single time, the game is going to be 100% different each and every single time. Countries will react differently to you. Countries will vary in power. Countries will pass laws that will skyrocket them forward ahead of you, and sometimes they will fail to pass laws and they will stay in the Stone Age. There is endless replayability, even if you happen to have to use a little bit of blockbuster magic and overlook some of the jankiness to see the gem. Then again, maybe this is just an old head thing. Back when I used to be able to play games for 10 hours a day as a kid, I never had the level of selection that the modern gamers do nowadays. At the same time, we never had the same amount of hype over games either. We had to dive deep into Nintendo Power magazines to get our scoop on games coming out into the future. Maybe that's why even disappointments were still perfectly playable for us. I still put 1,000 hours into Master of Orion 3, Railroad Tycoon 3, and Sword of the Stars 2, for instance. Comparatively bad games when you put them up against their predecessors, but again, still insanely fun in a vacuum. Now, I do think Paradox does have some work ahead of it to keep Victoria 3 fresh for future players. The journal entry system in particular needs a sizable amount of work before I consider it viable. Yet, Victoria 3 stands the test of time for me. It's easily as replayable as Europa Universalis 4, even if there are no mission trees for me to fill out when trying out new countries, even if I have to limit my options and avoid conquering Gaza just to keep it fresh. Anyhow, thank you for taking the time to listen to my TED Talk. I do hope you still enjoy playing Victoria 3 in spite of it, and always remember, Hail Hydra Cat.